All right, let's get you other news this Wednesday morning. South Africa's consumer inflation has slowed marginally in June, in line with market expectations. Statistics South Africa's data shows that the annual consumer price inflation was at 5.1% in June, down from 5.2% in May. The main contributors, we're told, to the annual inflation rate was housing and utilities, miscellaneous goods and services, as well as food and non-alcoholic beverages and transport. Inflation has remained above the 5% mark since the beginning of the year. Food inflation, however, has continued to slow, dipping from 4.3% in May to 4.1% in June. Higher price increases were recorded in sugar, sweets and desserts, as well as the mill, eggs and cheese categories. In its recent interest rates announcement, the Reserve Bank said it was concerned about the administered price inflation. Housing and utilities increased by 5.5% year on year and contributed 1.3 percentage points to the annual inflation rates. Economists expect inflation will continue to slow going forward, raising hopes, of course, of an interest rate cut before the end of the year. Consumer inflation expected to average around 4.9% for the year. Let's stay with news around commerce, so to speak. The U.S. Congress is currently revisiting the African Growth and Opportunities Act, that's AGOA, with the intention of extending the trade program for another 16 years. Now, this legislation is widely considered a cornerstone of economic relations between the United States and countries on the continent. Many in Washington believe it's contributed significantly to economic growth and prosperity among its nations. However, some experts have pointed out flaws in the legislation that may prevent its benefits from being evenly distributed across the continent. Let's make sense of all of this now. Bring in our guest here in studio with us, Ntombi Mbele-Thomo, who is an independent economist and is joining us, as I mentioned, to help us connect the dots. Welcome to the SABC News Channel, Ntombi. Thanks for popping by.
Sure, thank you for having me, Ayanda. The pleasure is all mine.
Yeah, so what a time for us to try and make sense of these, multilateral trade agreements that are in place, characterized by AGOA and many other gatherings, because of the different movements that are also unfolding geopolitically speaking. We know in the US, we're counting down to an all-stakes election, which is going to unfold in November. But we also have had our watershed moments here insofar as elections is concerned. How do you see those movements possibly affecting, agreements like the AGOA?
Sure. I mean, to start with, you can already sense globally that there is a shift in what has been, periodically known as conventional power. We've seen in the UK as well, for the first time in a while, where there's been a power shift from the Conservatives to Labour. And so you see that, with us, you've alluded to as well, with what we now have as the GNU. And so you are understanding that there is a power shift, and with a power shift, there's going to be influence with policy as it pertains to trade, pertains to investment and infrastructure investment, and how that will ultimately lead to the global trade, as well as the agreements that have already been founded. So I think with AGOA, to go back to it, it is really an important forum that is being had, particularly, as mentioned, ahead of the 5th of November. We are all looking to see if Donald Trump's going to come back as being president of the US and what that really means. But for South Africa, the importance of having our Minister of Trade being there is that the US is really our second largest trade partner. And for that, it is of significant importance for us to have very sound bilateral relations with ourselves and the US. And so using this forum is an opportunity for us to enhance our advocacy as to positioning ourselves within AGOA, being able to reinstate our presence in AGOA. As you all know, last year we've had quite very colorful issues with the US, with there being an assumption that we had, afforded Russia some weaponry, and that kind of negatively affected our relations with the US to the point where some lawmakers actually said that South Africa should no longer be part of, or should no longer be eligible to be part of the AGOA in the coming years. And so I think this is a time where we reinforce and reinstate our trade position. Also, as a key player in the global south, I think our proximity to the leadership of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, as well as being part of the BRICS nation, and also being part of the global south regional leader, as you can call it, that on its own has some merit. And I think it would not be as easy as it's presumed that we could be as Uganda no longer part of the AGOA agreement.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that it felt like the relationship between South Africa and the US had been strained last year because of all those different discussions. But I wonder what you reckon ought to kind of top the agenda for Team South Africa as we take part in AGOA this time around, given those many moving parts. I mean, it feels like, in a way, we're still in a context where we're building scenarios about a Democratic win versus a Republican win in the US.
Right. I think for South Africa, what could be our, top of agenda priority is that we need to ensure that when we speak at the forum, we prioritize and highlight the importance of reviewing really the annual certification review process that is being used in AGOA, that at any point can be enforced to make a country, ineligible to be part of the agreement, and the fact that that agreement and the review process is unilaterally controlled by the US. I think in a time where the African continent is really becoming, a trade powerhouse and being able to shift the multilaterals between what is the historical Western power and the emergence of your China and your Russia and your Brazil, that where we position ourselves as South Africa in being a hub to the African continent and really being the most industrious of economies on the continent, we actually have a lot of, bargaining power and chip that we should be using. I think, as a trade specialist, my hope would be that the Department of Trade and Industry, through the very, knowledgeable Park Stow under the ministry, that would be something that he positions as a priority, firstly. And I think from the annual review process, it would also be to look at how we position the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in the form of regional investment coming from the US. The US is a beneficiary. I mean, I think it must be stated that the AGOA agreement is mutually beneficial for both the US as well as, the global South, but also the African continent. No one is really giving, it's not like, an aid-rated policy program. This is a trade block. It's a trade, engagement and agreement. And so no one's really doing anyone a favor here.
So it's in the US's interest to also make sure this is
Absolutely, especially in light of the shift of the power, because what you're seeing is that, as I mentioned earlier, the US is the second largest trade partner to South Africa, but the first is China, and that has not always been, in pre-1994. So you can already see that, even our engagement in BRICS is telling you that we're not really putting all our eggs in one basket, and that we are diversifying, and that the world is way more multipolar now, where the central powers of international engagement and global trade no longer sit in Washington, but are much more dispersed into, people that, or maybe countries that the Washington lawmakers would rather not have, like as China and Russia.
Right.
And we as South Africa are actually, engaging with those countries in very fruitful, very favorable bilateral engagements. And so I think that is something that is a positioning that we should use, and I'm hoping that's what we're going to prioritize in these engagements.
Fair enough. There had been criticisms around whether or not everybody who's part of the AGOA agreement is benefiting equally. I think I mentioned that as part of my introduction as well. Help us break down what that means. I mean, where are the imbalances and how do we straighten them out?
I would really contend with the view that there is equal beneficiation from AGOA. I think that countries like South Africa would be higher beneficiaries than a country that is of a smaller economic size like Botswana. So I think we must also look at the size of an economy to be able to see what the beneficiation is, but also look at the interest in the US in terms of what are the demands in terms of trade. So if there's a lot of demand for textile and clothing and diamonds versus what Kenya is able to offer in terms of its endowment, therefore you can already see that the dispersion is not going to be even, that the beneficiation from a South African point of view or Botswana will be much higher than that of a Kenya. And that also speaks to the investment in infrastructure and in creating value chains. It is much more beneficial for a US to increase value chains in sub-Saharan Africa because of the beneficiation it gets from an export point of view in meeting the demands of US customers, US industries. So it's much more beneficial for them to increase their value chains in South Africa, in Botswana, than it would be in a Uganda, for an example. So I think, from also looking at endowment, it is a utopian view to say that we are expecting there to be even distribution, because there really isn't globally in any trade bloc.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that should be a view that should be contended with by traders.
Fair enough. It's something to think about. You mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area, and I remember us talking about this for years. You know, this hope that one day we'll be able to create a single market on the continent. If we get that right, hopefully, then we are able to make sure that the beneficiation is a whole lot more equal than it is. How are we doing insofar as that is concerned? And where do you reckon some of those hurdles are, you know, in finally getting around to ensuring that it is much easier to trade among countries on the continent before we even look at bringing on the likes of Washington and the global north?
Sure. I think in as far as ironing out and understanding what the objective of the African Continental Free Trade Area is, we are spot on. I think where we are currently is that not a lot of countries, well, I think a majority of countries, you would correct me if I'm wrong, have already rectified to be part of the trade area. I think that's a positive sign. But when you look at the nuances of how this will be done in a continent where traveling, I understand, is still quite a cumbersome exercise. For me to go to Egypt, for example, you know, it's much more expensive, much more, in terms of accessibility from an airline point of view, much more harder than traveling to a direct flight going to the UK. And so those are some of the infrastructural challenges that I think have not been fully explored within the African Continental Free Trade Area discussion. And I think within the specific, I think they've got regional heads where they are actually looking at what are the regional hurdles that are going to be an issue for the effectiveness and for us to actually realize and materially benefit from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So, as I've stated, infrastructure is a really big hurdle. I do also think that we have in African countries a lot of, we don't have strong synergies when it comes to the politics of the day.
Right.
We're seeing with what's going on in Kenya. You're seeing that there aren't a lot of African leaders that are intervening, in as much as we are sovereign states, and that must be respected. But when there are issues that are affecting human rights, issues that are affecting economic prosperity or people's ability to yield in their investments, I saw some of the banks that are in Kenya are not being opened in the major cities because there's a lot of protests and rioting. So that effectively affects business. And if we're not engaging in the politics of how to really synthesize and move in a way that, one, politically we're aligned, but two, we're able to then, in the politics, move to the commercial part where we formulate policies that are going to enable trade to be better facilitated within the continent. I do think that it's still a great idea, but it still needs a lot of work to be done and a lot of political and will and governance will to be done by the African leaders.
Absolutely. So much to think about, but all worth our time because of just how important all of this is. Ntombi Mbele-Thomo, thanks very much indeed for popping by.
Sure, thank
you. We
you.
appreciate the time. And of course, those gatherings will continue for much of the week ahead. As you've heard, Pakstau leading a South African delegation in Washington in the United States to hopefully help South Africa put its best foot forward as we try to make sure that we too walk away with something from these important summits.